Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I'm the storyteller, here to take you on a journey through a story that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Now, I know many of you use these stories to unwind before bed, so grab a blanket, get comfortable, and let your mind wander into a world where reality blurs and the lines between life and death are not so clear. Before we begin, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Let's grow this community together. And tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Let me know in the comments below. Now, relax, and let's dive into tonight's eerie tale. The building smelled like decades of other people's lives, cigarette smoke ground into yellowed wallpaper, cooking grease that had seeped into the very bones of the structure, and something else I couldn't quite place. Something stagnant, something waiting. It was as though the walls had absorbed every secret, every whispered word and broken dream that had ever passed through this place. The realtor had called it vintage charm, but as I signed the lease for apartment 4B, I knew she was just being kind about what was essentially a glorified closet in a structure that should have been condemned 20 years ago. But it was what I could afford after the divorce, after Sarah took the house, the savings, and what felt like most of my identity. The kitnet was barely 400 square feet, wedged into what had once been a larger apartment that some enterprising landlord had carved up like a Thanksgiving turkey. The hallway leading to my door was so narrow that two people couldn't pass without one pressing against the wall. The fluorescent light above flickered with the irregular rhythm of a dying heartbeat, casting a sickly glow on everything it touched. I moved in on a Tuesday, carrying everything I owned in the back of my Honda Civic, 3 boxes of books, a duffel bag of clothes, my laptop, and a small collection of kitchen supplies that Sarah had deemed unnecessary for her new life. The apartment came furnished, if you could call a sagging bed, a card table, and a mini fridge furnishing, but it was mine. After 6 months of sleeping on my brother's couch, even this felt like a palace. The first week passed uneventfully. I fell into a routine, coffee from the bodega downstairs, 8 hours at my accounting job, microwave dinners, and Netflix until I fell asleep to the distant sounds of the city filtering through thin walls. The building's other tenants were ghosts. I heard footsteps above me at odd hours, muffled conversations through the walls, the occasional slam of a door. But I never saw anyone. Not once. There was something odd about the building, though, a kind of oppressive silence that clung to the hallways, especially at night. The air in the building felt thick, as if something was waiting just beyond the edge of my vision, always present but never quite visible. One night, as I sat at my makeshift desk, trying to focus on work, the flickering light overhead began to pulse in time with a low hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. At first, I thought it was just the old wiring, until it started to sound like whispers. Low, indistinct murmurs. As if someone was speaking directly into my ear, but there was no one there. I stood up quickly, heart racing, and the room seemed to close in on me. The walls felt like they were moving, breathing with me, and I swore I could feel the air grow colder. A shiver ran down my spine as I glanced at the door. Why hadn't I noticed it before? There was a strange mark on the wood, as if something had scratched at it. The whispers grew louder, but not in a way that made sense. The words weren't intelligible, they sounded almost ancient. Like something that had been buried here for a long time. And suddenly, I realized with a growing sense of horror that the noises weren't just coming from the walls, they were coming from behind the door. From inside the apartment. My hand hovered over the door handle, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. A pressure began to build in the room, something heavier than the air around me, something suffocating. And then, without warning, I heard it, a knock. At first, I thought I imagined it. But then there was another. And another. Someone was outside. It was Thursday morning of my second week when I first saw him. I was running late, fumbling with my keys as I stepped into the hallway, trying to make it to work on time. The hallway, narrow as it was, felt claustrophobic, and the dim, flickering fluorescent light above cast long, sickly shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally. I noticed him immediately. A man walking toward me from the opposite end of the corridor. The space was so cramped that one of us would have to flatten against the wall to let the other pass. It was a familiar enough scenario. I'd done it countless times before, navigating the tight hallways with its walls that felt like they were closing in on you. I was about to step aside, when something compelled me to look up. His face. It wasn't just similar. It wasn't a vague resemblance that you might notice in a crowd and think, hey, that guy looks a little like me. No. It was my face. Down to the small scar above my left eyebrow, from when I fell off my bike at 7 years old. Even the same blue button-down shirt I'd put on that morning, the same khakis with the small coffee stain near the left pocket that I'd never quite managed to get out, and his hair, just as unruly as mine, falling in the same pattern that no amount of product could tame. And then, the most unsettling detail of all, his eyes. The way they looked back at me, vacant and empty, like a reflection in a mirror that had no soul behind it. But he wasn't walking toward me anymore. As I stood frozen, unable to move, he turned away from me and walked back the way he'd come, his footsteps slow and deliberate, disappearing around the corner near the stairwell. I don't know how long I stood there, the hallway stretching out in front of me, the hum of the dying fluorescent light echoing in my ears. My heart thudded in my chest, a cold sweat prickling across my skin. The logical part of my brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd been more tired than I thought. Maybe the flickering light had created some kind of optical illusion. Maybe I'd seen my own reflection in some surface I hadn't noticed. But no, there were no mirrors in the hallway. No reflective surfaces at all. Just faded wallpaper, peeling in some places, and scuffed linoleum flooring that had seen better days. I shook my head, trying to push the image of his face from my mind. But it was burned into my memory with unsettling clarity. The way he moved, the familiar slouch of his shoulders, the slight favor he gave to his right leg, where I had torn my ACL in college. Every single detail was perfect, which made it infinitely more disturbing than if it had been a mere trick of the light or a strange coincidence. If it had been just close, I could have convinced myself that I'd imagined it. But no, this was something else. The rest of the day at work passed in a blur. My thoughts kept returning to the encounter, replaying it over and over in my mind. I tried to convince myself it hadn't happened, that I'd just been seeing things, that the stress of the divorce, the move, the loneliness, were finally catching up to me. But deep down, I knew. I knew what I had seen. That evening, when I returned to my apartment, the building felt different. Heavy. The air seemed thicker, almost suffocating. I could hear the faint whispers again, the same low hum that had unsettled me before, like the walls themselves were speaking in a language I couldn't understand. And this time, it wasn't just the walls. The sound was coming from somewhere inside my apartment, from behind the door. I froze in place, the key trembling in my hand as I approached the door. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed since I'd left that morning. That something had shifted. I took a deep breath and turned the handle, pushing the door open with a slow, deliberate motion, afraid of what I might find on the other side. The changes were subtle, nothing dramatic, but enough to make me question my sanity. The kind of things you might not notice if you weren't paying close attention. The book I'd left open on the card table was now closed, though I remembered leaving it open to mark my place. The coffee mug in the sink was turned handle right instead of handle left, the way a right-handed person would naturally place it. I was left-handed. Always had been. I told myself I was misremembering, stress from the divorce, the move, starting over. It was normal to feel disoriented, wasn't it? But as I made my dinner, the feeling of being watched, of being replaced, clung to me. Someone else had been in my space. Someone else had been living a parallel version of my life. The encounters became more frequent. Every few days, I'd catch a glimpse of him in the hallway, always walking away from me, always dressed in clothes identical to mine. I began timing my exits differently, leaving earlier or later, trying to avoid whatever schedule he seemed to follow. But he was always there, a step ahead or behind, like a shadow that had learned to cast itself. And each time I saw him, something in my apartment would change. It started small. The position of my toothbrush in its holder. The way my shirts hung in the closet, organized by color instead of by how often I wore them. The television tuned to channels I never watched, the volume set to levels that hurt my ears. I'd find foods in my mini fridge that I didn't remember buying. Whole wheat bread instead of the white I preferred. Greek yogurt instead of regular. Almond milk, when I was lactose tolerant and had no need for alternatives. The changes felt like someone was trying to improve my life, making choices I might have made if I were a better version of myself, more organized, more health conscious, more disciplined. But they weren't my choices. They were preferences that weren't mine, and each one felt like a small theft of my identity. I started keeping a journal, documenting every change, every sighting. The pages filled quickly with increasingly frantic observations. The coffee maker was unplugged when I came home, I never unplug it. I found a gym membership card in my wallet, expires next month. I hate gyms. All my books were reorganized alphabetically by author, I organized them by genre. The handwriting in the journal looked like mine, but neater, more controlled. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie in bed, listening to the building's nocturnal symphony, creaking pipes, settling foundations, the shuffle of feet in apartments above and beside mine. But sometimes, the footsteps seemed to come from inside my own walls, as if someone was pacing the same small space, just slightly out of phase with reality. 3 weeks after the first sighting, I decided to confront whatever was happening. I positioned myself in the hallway, determined to face him directly instead of watching him walk away. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that seemed to move independently of anything that might create them. He appeared at exactly 8:47 a.m., just as I was beginning to think I'd imagined the whole thing. But this time, he wasn't walking away. He was walking directly toward me. His face, my face, was calm, almost serene. It was an expression I recognized, but one I had never worn myself. Confidence. The kind of quiet self-assurance that I'd always admired in others but never managed to cultivate. We stopped, perhaps 3 feet apart. Two men who couldn't occupy the same space, but somehow did. Up close, I could see that he wasn't exactly identical. His clothes were the same style but newer, better maintained. His hair was cut with more precision. His skin was clearer. His posture straighter. He was me, but polished, refined, as if someone had taken my blueprint and corrected all the small flaws. He smiled, a gesture I felt more than saw. Then, he stepped to his right, pressing against the wall to let me pass. The courtesy of it was somehow more disturbing than any confrontation would have been. As I moved past him, our shoulders brushed. And I could have sworn I felt the slightest tremor in the air, something cold, something strange, like static electricity, but there was no spark, no visible sign of anything. Only that sensation, that feeling of being watched, of something other watching me. I didn't look back. Our shoulders almost touched, and for just a moment, I felt a warmth that seemed to come from inside my own body, as if we shared the same circulation, the same heartbeat. A strange sensation, like a mirrored connection. I turned to look back, but the hallway was empty. That evening, I found my apartment completely transformed. Not rearranged, transformed. The furniture was the same, but everything else had been replaced with versions that were just slightly better, slightly more refined. The books on my shelf were hardcover editions of the same titles, pristine and unread. My clothes had been replaced with identical garments made of better fabrics, perfectly fitted. Even my laptop was the same model, but newer, faster, with a screen that didn't have the small scratch I'd lived with for 2 years. It was my life, but elevated, perfected, as if someone had taken everything I owned and upgraded it to the version I would have chosen if I'd had unlimited resources and better taste. I should have felt grateful, or at least curious. Instead, I felt a creeping dread that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Someone was systematically erasing my life and replacing it with something better, and I couldn't tell if it was kindness or conquest. The journal entries became more erratic. Some days, I'd find pages filled with handwriting I didn't remember creating, neat, measured observations about my daily routine, my habits, my preferences. The tone was analytical, almost clinical, as if I were a subject being studied rather than the author of my own observations. Subject prefers coffee black, but adds cream when stressed, one entry read. Sleeps on right side of bed despite living alone, suggests lingering attachment to previous domestic arrangement. Exhibits signs of depression, but resists treatment. Potential for improvement significant. I didn't remember writing those words, but they were in my handwriting, in my journal, written with my pen. The clinical detachment of the language made my skin crawl, as if I were reading a case study about myself, written by someone who knew me intimately but felt nothing for me. The encounters in the hallway became daily occurrences. He never spoke, never acknowledged me beyond that first polite gesture, but his presence was becoming more solid, more real, while I felt myself growing transparent. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in shop windows and be surprised to see myself at all, as if I'd expected to find nothing there. A fleeting shadow, a ghost of the person I once was. My apartment continued to evolve. The changes were no longer subtle improvements but wholesale replacements of my personality. My music collection was replaced with classical compositions I'd never listened to. My casual clothes disappeared, replaced by business attire I'd never worn. Even my food preferences were being rewritten, my cupboards filled with organic, health-conscious options that tasted like cardboard but looked like what a better version of me would choose. I tried leaving the building, staying in hotels, sleeping in my car, but each time I returned, the transformation had accelerated in my absence. It was as if my physical presence was the only thing slowing the process. Every hour I spent away gave him more time to establish himself in my space. The final encounter happened on a Monday morning, exactly 1 month after I'd first seen him. I stepped into the hallway to find him standing directly outside my door, key in hand, as if he belonged there more than I did. He was wearing a suit I'd never owned, carrying a briefcase I'd never bought, looking like the successful man I'd always planned to become but never managed to be. He looked at me with eyes that held no recognition, no acknowledgement that we shared anything more than a passing resemblance. In that moment, I understood, I was the interloper, the inferior copy, the rough draft that was no longer needed now that the final version had been completed. Sometimes, I think I catch glimpses of other versions of myself in the peripheral spaces, the man who never married Sarah, the one who took the job in California, the one who wrote the novel instead of becoming an accountant. They move through doorways that aren't quite there, living lives that are almost mine, making choices I almost made. And sometimes, in the small hours, when the building settles into its deepest silence, I wonder if they can see me too, just another might have been, walking the corridors of possibility, leaving no footprints, casting no shadow, existing only in the space between what is and what could have been. The fluorescent light continues to flicker overhead, marking time in a rhythm that belongs to no heartbeat I recognize. And I wait. I wait for whatever version of myself will emerge next from the corners of this narrow, impossible hallway that connects all the lives I might have lived, if only I'd been brave enough to live them. Story 2. The keys to Fazenda Santa Esperanza felt heavier than they should have in my palm. Their brass surface was warm from the afternoon heat that still clung to the metal, even as dusk painted the sky in shades of rust and amber. Dr. Carvalho had handed them over with a peculiar expression, something between relief and concern, before driving away in a cloud of red dust, leaving me alone with the sprawling coffee plantation and its century-old secrets. I was here for a month, tasked with cataloging the antique machinery scattered throughout the property for the Agricultural Museum in Sao Paulo. Simple enough work for an agronomist with a specialty in historical farming equipment. But what I hadn't expected was the profound silence that settled over the place once the sun disappeared behind the mountains. The main house creaked like an old ship as I settled in for my first night, the wooden floors releasing decades of stored heat with each small protest. I had set up my temporary office in what used to be the overseer's quarters, surrounded by dusty ledgers and faded photographs of workers whose names had long been forgotten. The electric lights hummed with an irregular rhythm, suggesting the wiring hadn't been updated since the 1950s. It was past midnight when I first heard them, the whispers. They drifted through the night air like smoke. So faint, I initially dismissed them as wind moving through the old structures. The property was vast, with numerous outbuildings, and I reasoned that any number of things could create such sounds. But as I lay in the narrow bed, listening to the house settle around me, the whispers grew more distinct. They seemed to originate from the direction of the old tolha, the massive wooden coffee processing barn that dominated the center of the compound. I'd examined it briefly during my afternoon survey. It was a magnificent structure with thick timber beams and a corrugated metal roof that had weathered countless seasons. More importantly, it was locked from the outside with a heavy padlock that showed no signs of recent use. The whispers continued for nearly an hour before fading into silence, leaving me to wonder if my isolation was already playing tricks on my mind. The second night brought a new development. The whispers returned, but this time, they carried something that made my blood run cold. My name. Marcus, the voice called, soft and mournful, drawn out like a sigh. Marcus, it's time for the night shift. I sat bolt upright in bed, every nerve ending suddenly alert. The voice was distinct now, undeniably human, undeniably calling to me. It seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if several people were speaking in unison, their words overlapping in an eerie harmony. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards cold beneath my bare feet. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the path to the tolha. The building stood silent and imposing, its windows dark, the padlock exactly where I'd left it. "Hello." I called out, feeling foolish even as the word left my lips. The only response was the distant sound of night insects and the rustle of coffee plants in the breeze. But as I turned to go back inside, I heard it again. "Come back to work, Marcus, the beams." The words seemed to hang in the air, lingering longer than they should have. They were thick with an unnatural weight, almost as if they had substance, as if the air itself had been twisted by them. My skin crawled as I stepped back towards the tolha, flashlight trembling in my hand. Something was wrong here. The house had always been silent, ominously so. The whispers were not just the product of a decaying building. They were intentional. They were calling me. I approached the tolha again, the beam of my flashlight trembling, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally along the weathered walls of the barn. The door, still locked, seemed almost too still, as though it were waiting for me to return. The night around me had grown oppressively silent, the air thick with something ancient and buried. I was no longer alone in this place. And as I stood there, heart racing, a part of me, deep inside, began to suspect that the tolha had been waiting for me all along. Won't process themselves, this time, the voice seemed to come from inside the tolha itself. I approached the building with growing unease, my flashlight beam dancing across its weathered exterior. The padlock was definitely secure, rust flakes scattered on the ground beneath it as evidence of its long closure. I walked the perimeter of the structure, checking every window, every gap in the boards. There was no way anyone could be inside. Yet the whispers continued. Sometimes in Portuguese, sometimes in what sounded like Italian, the languages of the workers who had once labored here during the height of the coffee boom. They spoke of quotas and deadlines, of beans that needed sorting and machines that required tending. But beneath the mundane work-related chatter, I detected an undertone of something else, something more sinister. Longing, perhaps, or an obsession that transcended death itself. On the third night, unable to sleep due to the increasingly persistent voices, I decided to investigate the smaller outbuildings scattered around the property. Armed with my flashlight and a growing sense of dread, I made my way to a shed I hadn't yet examined. The door was unlocked, which seemed odd, given the security measures elsewhere on the property. Inside, I found something that defied explanation. The shed had been converted into a makeshift workshop, with coffee processing tools laid out on a workbench, as if someone had just stepped away for a brief break. Hand-cranked sorters, bean scales, and sample roasters were arranged with meticulous care. The tools were old but well-maintained, their metal surfaces gleaming despite the building's obvious abandonment. More disturbing was the fresh coffee chaff scattered across the floor and the lingering aroma of recently roasted beans in the air. I picked up one of the tools, a small sorting paddle, and felt warmth radiating from its wooden handle. Someone had been here recently. Someone was still working. But that was impossible. I was alone on the property. Dr. Carvalho had been adamant about that, and I had seen no evidence of anyone else during my daily surveys. As I stood there, trying to process what I was seeing, the whispers started again. This time, they seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, surrounding me with urgent discussions about processing techniques and quality control. The bourbon beans need special attention, one voice insisted. Don't let them over-roast. Warned another, Marcus knows what to do. He understands the work. I fled the shed, my heart hammering against my ribs, and didn't stop running until I reached the main house. But even there, behind locked doors and drawn curtains, I could still hear them, dozens of voices carrying on conversations about work that had ended decades ago. Sleep became elusive. Each night, the voices grew stronger and more insistent. They no longer limited themselves to the hours after midnight. By the end of my first week, I could hear them during the day as well, faint murmurs that seemed to follow me as I went about my cataloging work. The most unsettling development came when I realized the voices knew details about my work that they shouldn't have known. They commented on the machines I was examining, offered suggestions about their operation, and even corrected some of my initial assessments with an expertise that made me question my own knowledge. The Pinholland's Pulpier needs adjustment on the separation screens, one voice informed me as I studied the very machine in question. Marcus, you're missing the hydraulic tension mechanism on the Ligerwood conveyor, another added. And when I looked more carefully, I found exactly what they described. How could voices that existed only in my mind possess knowledge I didn't have? The breaking point came during my second week on the property. I had just finished reviewing the machines in the Tolha and was preparing to leave for the day when the whispers came to a halt. For the first time since I had arrived, the silence was deafening. I froze, unsure whether I should feel relief or terror. It was then that I saw him. A figure, indistinct and shadowed, stood at the far end of the Tolha. His face was obscured, but his presence was undeniable. He was watching me. The air grew thick, as though every inch of the room was suddenly charged with something heavy, something ancient. My heart raced, and I took a step back, but the figure didn't move. Instead, the whispers returned, not from the walls, but from him. You don't belong here, the voice rasped, a chilling echo of all the voices I had heard before. This work, this place, it belongs to us now. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. The figure remained still, his eyes, though hidden, fixed on me. For a moment, I wasn't sure if he was a man or something else entirely, something that had existed long before I arrived, and would continue to exist long after I left. I don't know what happened next. One moment I was standing there, paralyzed by the presence of the figure in the Tolha, and the next, I was outside, gasping for air, the night wind biting at my skin. The barn loomed in the distance, its windows dark, the padlock hanging just where it had been the night before. I haven't gone back to the shed. I haven't gone near the Tolha again. But the whispers follow me, fainter now, but ever present. And sometimes, when I think I hear them the loudest, I catch the scent of freshly roasted coffee in the air, reminding me that something is still working here. Still processing. Something that doesn't want me to leave. By the end of the week, the aroma of freshly roasted coffee began permeating the main house. I awoke one morning to the rich, intoxicating scent filling every room. It was so strong, I could almost taste the oils in the air, so fresh, it seemed as if someone had been roasting beans in the kitchen moments before. But the kitchen was empty, its ancient stove cold to the touch, and there was no coffee to be found anywhere in the house. The scent followed me throughout the day, growing stronger whenever I approached the Tolha. By afternoon, it had become so overwhelming that I developed a headache from its intensity. Yet when I stepped away from the property entirely, driving to the nearest town for supplies, the aroma vanished completely. It was waiting for me when I returned that night. As I lay in bed, listening to the increasingly urgent whispers, I began to understand that I was being invited to join something that had never truly ended. The voices weren't simply echoes of the past. They were active, ongoing, a continuation of work that had somehow transcended the physical realm. "We've been waiting for you, Marcus," the voices chorused as one. "You understand the machines better than anyone who's come before. The harvest season never ends here. There's always more work to be done," another added, the words hanging heavily in the air. I found myself getting dressed, though I couldn't remember making the conscious decision to do so. My feet carried me toward the Tulha, as if I were sleepwalking, but my mind was sharply aware of every step. The padlock fell away from the door at my touch, though I was certain I hadn't brought a key. Inside the Tulha, the scene defied everything I thought I knew about reality. The vast space was alive with activity, though I couldn't see anyone working. Machinery hummed and whirred with purposeful efficiency. Conveyor belts moved endless streams of coffee beans through various stages of processing, and the air itself seemed to pulse with the rhythm of industrial productivity. But the workers, they were shadows. Translucent figures that moved with practiced efficiency through motions they had performed countless times in life. They acknowledged my presence with nods and gestures, inviting me to join their eternal shift. "Your expertise is needed," one shadow explained without words. The communication happened directly in my mind, bypassing my ears completely. "The old ways are being forgotten, but you remember. You can help us maintain the standards." I understood then. This was what had happened to others who had come before me, who had come to catalog the equipment. The whispers weren't trying to drive me away. They were recruiting me. Drawing me into a workforce that had found a way to continue their labor even after death. The seductive pull of their purpose was almost overwhelming. Here was meaningful work. Important work, the kind of agricultural preservation I had dedicated my career to studying. These workers had achieved something remarkable. They had found a way to continue their craft indefinitely. But as I watched the shadow figures moving through their routines, I noticed something that chilled me more than anything I had experienced so far. Some of the shadows were wearing modern clothing. One appeared to be dressed in khakis and a polo shirt, not unlike my own fieldwork attire. How many others had accepted the invitation to join the night shift? I backed toward the door, fighting against an almost magnetic pull that seemed to emanate from the machinery itself. The shadow workers turned to watch me, their expressions impossible to read, yet their gaze felt like 1,000 silent pleas to stay, to join them. Their presence was overwhelming, as if they were silently begging for me to become part of their eternal cycle. The hum of the machinery seemed to pulse in my chest, syncing with the beat of my heart. I could feel it, the pull to remain, to continue what they had started, what they were still doing, even beyond death. The sensation was intoxicating, like the aroma of the coffee that filled the air, impossible to ignore, impossible to turn away from. I should have turned and left, but something deep inside me whispered that this was the answer, the purpose I had been searching for in my work. The shadows that surrounded me weren't just workers. They were keepers of something far older, something beyond the realm of simple labor. And I was standing at the threshold, teetering on the edge of something infinite. Well, there you have it, another twist in the story, another mystery unraveled, or perhaps deepened. If you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and share it with others who appreciate a good mystery. Your support means the world and helps keep the stories coming. If you're curious about what happens next, or if you have your own thoughts on the story, leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, stay curious, stay brave, and remember, sometimes the most unsettling things are the ones that never really end. See you in the next video.